Well, good afternoon, everyone. A snowy afternoon it is today, and I hope that you are staying warm and safe and well. And thank you again for taking the time to listen to this little Hebrew study that we do every week, and pray that you are being blessed and encouraged by it. We are continuing, as you can see on your screen, in First Samuel chapter 30, and following the story of David as he is navigating through all the nuances of getting to be king. And as we saw last week, how God delivered David from um, being a part of the Philistine army and having to potentially fight against his own kinsmen, and how God delivered him from that. And they had to be on kind of a cloud nine experience. I'm sure that they were just feeling so happy and so elated that God delivered them, and they didn't have to be in this situation to fight against Israel, and just had to be spiritually strengthened and encouraged. But we're going to see that in chapter 30, things don't always continue to go along smoothly. And so we see in verse 1, Vayehi Bevol David v'anashim Ziklag. And so David came, and it came to pass. In the Bible, the term Vayehi Bevol, when it came to pass, is kind of like once upon a time. It has the same connotation as when you're reading a book that has once upon a time. It's changing the narrative. It's trying to take you into a sidebar note, take you away from what you just read in the previous chapter, and now make you come and focus on this new episode of understanding. And so you could have said, once upon a time, David and his men came to Ziklag, and it was 3 days after they had left. The words here are a little strange. It says on the third day, but it could be that it had been 3 days since the Amalekites raided Ziklag. Whatever the case was, they came upon Ziklag, which is where the city that David was given when he came to live in the Philistine area. He was given that city, and the Amalekites, you remember, are the ones that David had been raiding and pillaging prior to this, and that's how they survived. Of course, when David pillaged and ravished those cities, he left no witnesses. Everyone was killed. Again, we talked about that a while ago, but it seems that what we're trying to look at is, did the Amalekites figure out it was David and try to take revenge? If they did it in somewhat of a different way. Maybe they didn't know, and maybe this was just part of everybody's out for himself, and you raid who you can raid. They came upon the city of Ziklag and found that it was not protected. Again, that's kind of maybe a commentary on David's lack of security for his family, that he didn't leave somebody there to protect them. However, this happened. The Amalekites attacked Ziklag. Um, and they burned it with fire. So you can imagine David and his 600 men coming back from a very high emotional, somewhat spiritual experience of experiencing God's deliverance and glory. And then they come home and see the fire and the whole city burned. And from afar, they had no idea what had happened. Even though it says in verse 2 that the women and children were taken captive and no one was killed, they would not have known that from afar. They would not have known that until they got there. So you can imagine what they must have felt in their hearts, and wondering, well, like any of us would, well, how could God deliver me 3 days ago and now all of this is happening? Why is this? Why did we would sometimes say, and it's been said, why did God let this happen? Why am I experiencing this? What's going on here? Let's see if we can find any clues as we're going on. So we know that the women and the children and the great and small were taken captive. They did not kill them, but carried them away. That's probably put in here. Obviously, this was all written afterwards. It was put in here just because of the intensity of how they must have felt any one of us who have maybe suffered a loss of their home due to a fire. Um, it's unimaginable the sense of loss and the grief that you feel when everything you have is burned up and destroyed, and especially if you don't know if your loved ones have gotten out, and the panic that grips you. And I think that's why this verse 2 was put in here quickly so that the reader would not be carried down that avenue, even though this still was quite a terrible thing. Verse 3, David came and his men to the city, found it was burned with fire. Again, reiterating the same thing from verse 2, that their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. How would they have known this? Maybe they didn't see the typical, corpses laying in the streets, although they could have been in buildings. Somehow they were able to determine that there was no loss of life here, but yet all their possessions, all their fortress, everything was burned, and their loved ones were gone. Here we have verse 4, and it explains the emotion. Vayisa David v'ha'am asher ito et kolam vayavku, and they lifted their voices, and vayivku, they wept ad asher, until that. And then there's ain, which is the word for no or not or nothing left. Bachem, they koach, power, and leave coat, to weep. They had no more power to weep. You can hear that in the sound of the words. What struck me about this is with Hebrew, you're able to learn the inflection and the mood and the voice of the words by the type of verbs that are being used and the verbal endings. And there's seven different levels of verbal endings to express different emotions and different moods in the verbs. And so you would expect this would be so intense that all of the verbs would have the most intensive, um, powerful forms written to them. But notice as we look underneath, lifted up, it's a cal, which means it's just a textbook. You look under wept, it's a cal. You look under weep, it's a cal. None of these words, while obviously it's intense because it says they had no more power within them. Um, the intensivity is not being brought out in the words, which I find that quite interesting. I don't have an answer for that because you would think that it would really have been such a deep, intense weeping that it would have used the very intense verbs, but it does not. And so that is very strange. But still, the effect is the same. All the people, their families were gone. They were going to be devastated by it. And of course, verse 5, David's family gets their own little verse here saying, yeah, by the way, both of David's wives names them Ahinoam and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, were taken captive. And of course, verse 6 says David was distressed, but again, in a Cal form, not in a PL form, but it was distressed me'od. The me'od is something used in the Bible for um, signifying very intense, very much. It's the word for much, for great, bringing it to another higher level than just the verb itself would. And look at what happens here. His men are going to turn on him, and David is grieved. But again, in a cal form, not in a PL form. But it looks like they were going to stone him again in a cal form, not in a intensive form. So maybe this has to do with because of the time had passed from the occurrence until the writing, everybody kind of calmed down a little bit. And so the intensivity was probably there in reality, but afterwards it was not. So the end effect is the same. The people were going to stone him because they were so grieved of all the loss. And then we get to the last verse here that I want to focus upon. And it says, and you may have heard sermons preached upon this, for David strengthened himself in the Lord, is how the King James would read. The Hebrew gives us a much better way to look into this. First, it uses the word for strengthen himself. Now, notice I was pointing out the other verbs are in a cal form. This one is not in a cal form. It is in what's called a hitpael. This is a intensive form of a verb, but it is also a reflexive form of the verb, which means it's something that comes out from inside of you and it causes you to change. You do it to yourself. It would be that it was you do it to yourself. It's by inward cause. It's not from an outside influence, but it's from an inside influence. And that's what I find fascinating about this is David influenced himself. Let's look at some of the other meanings of that word. I think it is so neat to look at the word chazak. And we're going to look at the Targumim, and it is spelled with a chet, zion, and a kuf. And it comes from the word to squeeze together, to be thick, to be solid. I love that there is so much written about this, that this word has many different ways to unpack it, to join, to repair, to strengthen, to attach to count as merit, to be grateful. And then we go to the next page and take it even further, to take as a possession, to take hold of, to presume, to be known for. Then we get to the Hitpael rendering. And again, these are the commentators using they feel are the safe textbook explanations of just to become solid and strong, to feel encouraged, to take courage. That's from Marcus Yastros, which is a Hebrew um, lexicon. We're going to go to Gesenius, which is a Christian lexicon, and here we see very similar to bind fast to something, to be confirmed, to be established, and you get this, you get the idea. You know, all of these words help you gain a little bit deeper insight into something deeper than just David strengthening himself. But notice how in what mind frame he strengthened himself. Um, the Hebrew words here is Ba, Yahweh. It's the Tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vav He, and it has the preposition Beit in front of it to say that he strengthened himself in Yahweh. Or as we like to look at this, is the merciful, compassionate side of God. So what David did was immerse himself and remind himself of God's mercies, of God's grace, of God's provision for him and taking care of him. And now he ties it to again, very interesting, to the word Elohav or Elohim. It's another form of Elohim. This is in the third masculine singular and in a masculine form, applying it to himself, that he was saying, this is my God, this is his God. It is bringing it in a personal form, that what he's saying is that God is merciful and powerful, and that is what I'm going to remind myself of. I'm not going to let myself be distracted by what I see, the burning buildings, the missing people, the angry soldiers standing there with rocks in their hands ready to pelt him because they're so grieving. This is the depths of despair, the deep grieving that he's in the midst of, lower than probably we can ever imagine a person being in, a sense of grief. But in this deep, deep sense of grief, David went inside of himself to remind himself of who God was, of God's mercy, of God's compassion. He probably told himself, God didn't bring me this far to let me die now. God gave me a promise that I'm going to be king. God gave me a promise that I'm going to sit on the throne. God delivered me from the lions and the bears and the Philistine Goliath. God just delivered me from the Philistine armies. Rehearsed all these things that God did for him. How long it took, how long, I don't know. What is interesting, though, that this word chazak, to strengthen, is in an imperfect form. Imperfect is something we don't have in um, English, we might say it's a future tense, but it doesn't necessarily mean future. It means something that isn't yet completed. So what the verse is saying here, it wasn't just that David sat down for 5 minutes, pumped himself all up, and now he was all ready to go and everything was going to be fine. This is something that never was completed, that this continued for we don't know how long. But this episode here of David Chazak, strengthening, pulling himself together, collecting one's strength, becoming solid and strong in his faith was something that continued and was never completed. He continued it all the way through. And so that is, I think, the beauty of this, of how we each have the ability every day to remind ourselves of God's mercy and God's power and strength to work in our lives, to remind ourselves of His promises that He will never leave us and never forsake us, that He has betrothed Himself to us and made us His bride. Another way to look at it is He made us one of His children. He put His Spirit inside of us, and think on those things and strengthen yourself in those things. So God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and look forward to joining us again next week. Bye bye.